On January the 16th in 1963, there appeared in various newspapers across the state of Alabama a letter. The title of the letter was A Call to Law and Order and Common Sense. Kind of a strange title when you consider that the 11 people who signed it were all clergy. But that was the title of the writing. Therein, they acknowledged that in short order they expected that certain schools and universities would be ordered by the courts to desegregate. This letter was written just a couple of days after George Wallace, in his inauguration address, said, segregation today, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever. In this letter, these 11 clergy, not all Christians, but there were pastors, priests, bishops, and rabbis who had signed this. And therein, they laid out what they said was an orderly way and a common sense approach to dealing with things over the next few months and years. In particular, there were 7 principles that they called forth for the community to consider using. And in those, one of those principles was that there is no freedom for any one person if there is not freedom for all. They suggested that we be very intentional and that we be very slow in how we progress through this time. On April the 12th, 1963, that day being Good Friday, another letter appeared, this time signed by 8 of the 11. And its title was A Call for Unity. And therein they brought forth that a few days before that there had been a demonstration in Birmingham that had become violent. And they recalled that their principles included nonviolence in the face of the changes that needed to happen. They also said, we ask that we take a little longer, that we wait, that those folks who are seeking these rights wait longer so that we can be more peaceful in doing this. And in the midst of the writing, they said that the violence had been brought about not by the sheriff, or the police chief, or the governmental officials, or the resistance of anyone, but by outside agitators who had come in and stirred all of this up. And all of this had taken place in our precious Southland. About 4 days later, a letter was written to address the concerns of both of these letters. You and I know it as a classic of the 20th century literature, and we know it by the title, Letter from a Birmingham Jail. It was written by the chief outside agitator, Martin Luther King Jr. And therein he pointed out to these clergy to whom he was writing this public letter that perhaps they did not realize it, but that they were asking people to wait who had been waiting for 350 years. he also said they had said in their letter that before they do this kind of direct action, there should be negotiation. And he said, you seem to be ignoring the fact that we have been trying to negotiate for months. And that the reason I'm here and the reason we're doing this is no one will negotiate with us. These were three very important letters. And each of these letters reflects a way in which someone chose to take a stand based on their faith. I dare say that had you asked anyone of those three parties if this were a faithful stance, they would have said, absolutely. Yet every one of these letters was greeted not just with some warmth and celebration, but especially with anger and hostility. In our gospel today, Jesus tells his disciples something that I think is very important for us to hear, yet it is very difficult to hear. You think that I came to bring peace. I came not to bring peace, but the sword. I came not to bring peace, but division. Now that seems harsh for you and me. It seems a very difficult statement to hear as we talk about the God of love. But those disciples knew exactly what Jesus was saying. For you see, in the time in which they lived, Judaism was in flux. The temple had been destroyed. And Judaism itself was striving to find what it meant to be Jewish. But more than that, in the Gentile world in which they lived, there were many, many, many gods. A village might decide that as a village, this is the God we're going to worship. And the head of the household always, meaning the man, always had the authority to say who that household would worship if they were outside the village. So let's imagine that if you decided to follow Jesus and your daddy said you were worshiping someone else, what do you think would happen? You would be ostracized, you might be run out of the house, and you may be shunned and never spoken to again. If you were part of a village and you chose to follow Jesus and they followed someone else, the same thing could happen for you there. You see, the coming of the Messiah into the world was one that shook the world, and it brought division. Every one of these letter writers could be accused of bringing division, despite the fact that every one of them thought that they were doing something faithful. So this truth of Jesus, I think, is there not just for the disciples then, but for the disciples now. For you and me as we live a faithful life. And here's my takeaway from this whole conflagration. If we truly follow Jesus, if we are the true disciples of Christ, at some point in our lives, people are not going to like what we do. It may be to the point that not only do they not like it, Not only may they get angry, but we may live under some kind of threat of our life, knowing in reality that we're doing what we truly believe it means to be a follower of Jesus. Two of the signatories to that letter were Episcopal bishops, guys. Two were Methodist bishops. One of the Methodist bishops wrote a book on ministerial ethics and etiquette. He thought he knew what he was doing, and he believed that it was right. Yet you and I look back on what they did, and we do so at least with questioning, but with deep concern and perhaps even with embarrassment. They lost something because they took a stand. Martin Luther King Jr. lost his life because he took a stand. So that's where we are. We who claim to follow Jesus, we who claim to be disciples of Christ, who came not to bring peace, but division. Now, I think it would be very, very easy for me, for myself, to offer as my great prayer that God rid us of this burden and make it easy. Don't make people be mad at me because of what I do or I say. Just let it be smooth. But I'm not going to do that because I don't think that would be faithful either. My prayer for us is twofold. That you and I have eyes wide open enough to the world around us that we are willing to take a stand, a faithful stand for what is just and what is right. And a prayer that God will give us the strength and the courage to do it. And you see, I think as God does that, you and I doing what God has called us to do will live fully into being disciples of Jesus as we support each other in prayer and worship and work. Amen.